Reality is that America is not God, America is not the end of the earth, and it doesn't matter what the Americans think. In the final analysis, the truth will come out.
What if I told you that before Malcolm X, before the Black Panthers, there was a man who dared to take up arms, not out of hate but out of survival? A man who believed that freedom was not just something you marched for, but something you defended, with your life, if necessary. His name, Robert F. Williams. And for decades, America tried to erase him from the story. This isn't the version of the civil rights movement they taught you in school, because this story has a gun in it. Born in the segregated South in 1925, Robert Franklin Williams came into the world like so many black children of his time, under the weight of silence, survival, and systemic violence. He grew up in Monroe, North Carolina, a place so small it barely registered on a map, but large enough for the Ku Klux Klan to carve fear into its backroads. His earliest memories weren't of hope or progress, they were of lynchings, of whispers behind closed doors, of black folks knowing their place. But Robert was different. Even as a child, he asked the question many adults were too afraid to voice out loud: why aren't we allowed to fight back? World War II offered him an escape and a mirror. Williams enlisted in the Marine Corps, one of the first African Americans to do so after President Roosevelt's order desegregated the military in 1941. But freedom overseas didn't match the reality at home. While fighting fascism abroad, Williams saw American racism up close in the barracks. Black soldiers were humiliated, mistreated, and relegated to menial labor. He returned from the war not with patriotic pride, but with radical clarity. He had fought for a nation that refused to fight for him. Back in Monroe, Williams saw something terrifying. Nothing had changed. White supremacy was still law, the Klan still rode at night, and black people still disappeared without explanation. But he also saw something else, a void in leadership. The local NAACP chapter was struggling, clinging to a nonviolent approach in a town drowning in racial terror. Robert Williams didn't just join the chapter, he took it over. At just 32, he became president and immediately transformed it from a quiet, reluctant group into a force of resistance. He didn't believe in waiting for justice, he believed in meeting it head-on. It didn't take long for Monroe's white establishment to notice. In 1957, when the Klan planned another attack on the black community, Williams and a group of armed black veterans were waiting. They weren't there to start a war, but they made it clear, if one came, they would finish it. He called them the Black Armed Guard. Their mission, protect their people, not with signs and songs, but with strategy and shotguns. Williams wasn't just defending lives, he was redefining black resistance. But Monroe wasn't ready for that kind of truth, and neither was the NAACP. That same year, the Klan tried to storm the house of a black doctor who had dared to speak up. Williams and his men arrived first. Shots were fired. The attackers fled. No one died, but the message was unmistakable. Black people weren't just praying anymore, they were protecting. The NAACP panicked. Publicly, they denounced violence in any form. Privately, many leaders feared Robert was becoming a liability, but to the black folks in Monroe, then came the kissing case. 2 young black boys, ages 7 and 9, were arrested, beaten, and sentenced to reform school for allegedly kissing a white girl on the cheek during a game. The case was so absurd, so cruel, that it drew international outrage. But it was Robert F. Williams who raised his voice first. He called the charges what they were: racial terrorism against children. And for the first time, the world turned its gaze on Monroe. But what they saw was not what they expected. They didn't see Martin Luther King's calm marches. They saw armed black men standing their ground. They saw defiance. They saw fearlessness. And they saw Robert F. Williams. That same year, Williams made a statement that would haunt him forever and define him in history. In an interview, he declared that black people had the right to meet violence with violence. It was a simple truth, but in Cold War America, it was heresy. The NAACP suspended him immediately. Newspapers painted him as a militant. Politicians called him dangerous. But to many in the black community, especially the younger generation, Williams wasn't a problem. He was a blueprint. This was before the Panthers, before the leather jackets and raised fists, before, by any means necessary, echoed through the streets. Robert F. Williams had planted the seed, and it terrified the establishment. The idea that black Americans could and should defend themselves against racist violence wasn't just radical, it was revolutionary. But with his rising profile came new enemies. The FBI began watching him. Local police plotted against him. His home was under constant surveillance. Threats poured in daily, but Robert refused to run. Instead, he built a radio station, Radio Free Dixie, and began broadcasting messages of liberation, resistance, and empowerment across the South. He knew what he was doing wasn't just activism, it was warfare, not of bullets, but of narratives. Because if he could change the way black people saw themselves, as protectors, as warriors, then no amount of white supremacy could ever truly win. But how long can you fight the system before the system fights back? Imagine being hunted by your own country, not for a crime of greed or violence, but for refusing to be a victim. That's exactly what happened to Robert F. Williams. The man who once led the local NAACP chapter in North Carolina would soon find himself at the top of the FBI's most wanted list. Why? Because he dared to say, "We will no longer die quietly." It all came to a boiling point in 1961. Racial tension in Monroe had reached its limit. Freedom Riders, young black and white activists traveling through the South, had arrived to challenge segregation. But in Monroe, the response wasn't just angry, it was explosive. The Klan mobilized. White mobs patrolled the streets with rifles. Local police either stood by or joined in. Monroe became a war zone, and in the middle of it all was Robert F. Williams, organizing defense patrols, protecting the Freedom Riders, and trying desperately to prevent a massacre. Then came the setup. Amid the chaos, a white couple drove into a black neighborhood. Tensions were sky high. Shots had been fired that day. Roads were blocked. Fear gripped both sides. Williams and his wife Mabel took the couple in, not as hostages, but for their safety. When they left unharmed, Williams thought the danger had passed. He was wrong. The state now had what it needed, an excuse. Robert F. Williams was charged with kidnapping, a federal offense, and just like that, the man who once represented peaceful protest was branded a fugitive. But this wasn't just about one man, it was about control, about silencing a voice that refused to echo the status quo. Robert knew the stakes. He had two options, surrender or escape. So he ran, but not out of fear. He ran with purpose. He and Mabel fled the country, crossing into Canada, then flying to a place that would shock both the American government and the civil rights establishment. They landed in Cuba. Yes, Cuba, in the middle of the Cold War, in the heart of the so-called enemy camp. And Fidel Castro welcomed them with open arms. For the U.S. government, this was a nightmare scenario, a black American revolutionary, broadcasting messages of resistance from behind the Iron Curtain. In Cuba, Williams became a hero of the Third World. He launched Radio Free Dixie, this time on an international scale. Through shortwave frequencies, his voice traveled across continents, speaking to black Americans still living under Jim Crow, still afraid to fight back. He read poetry, quoted Frederick Douglass, blasted Motown records, called for unity, called for self-defense, and above all, he called for dignity. Robert wasn't alone. Throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa, colonized people were rising up. And to them, Williams was not a fugitive, he was family. He met with revolutionaries, with Chinese diplomats, with African freedom fighters. While America painted him as a terrorist, much of the world saw him as a symbol of global black resistance, and he saw them right back. To Williams, the struggle of a black farmer in Alabama was no different than that of a guerrilla in Angola. The battlefield was everywhere, and so was hope. But exile came at a cost. He missed funerals, weddings, the laughter of his people, the soil of his hometown. While other civil rights leaders marched across bridges and filled TV screens, Williams remained in the shadows, labeled a traitor, silenced in textbooks, erased from polite history. Even within the civil rights movement, his name was spoken in hushed tones, too radical, too dangerous, too black. But guess who was listening? Young minds, restless hearts, people like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. The Black Panthers studied his writings, listened to his broadcasts, and built a movement off the blueprint he created. Meanwhile, back in America, the government tightened its grip. The FBI surveilled his supporters. The media painted him as a communist puppet. His name was lumped in with terrorists, despite never planting a bomb, never inciting a riot, never killing a soul. His crime? Teaching black people that their lives were worth protecting.
Well, I advocated violent self-defense because I don't think you can really have a defense against violent racists and against terrorists unless you're prepared to meet violence with violence.
Even in Cuba, he wasn't safe. In 1965, under increasing pressure and surveillance, Williams quietly left Havana and relocated again, this time to China. There he met with Mao Zedong himself. And guess what? The Chinese leader praised Williams for his courage, but even revolutionaries get tired. By the late 1960s, the tide was turning. The civil rights movement had changed. Martin was gone. Malcolm was gone. The Panthers were under siege, and the global spotlight began to dim. After nearly a decade in exile, Robert F. Williams made a daring decision. He returned to the United States, not in handcuffs, not in surrender, but to fight his charges in court. And here's the twist. When he landed in Michigan, the federal government didn't throw him in prison for life. They quietly dropped the charges. No grand trial, no front-page headlines, just silence. Why? Because they feared what that courtroom would become, a stage for the very revolution they tried to suppress. They couldn't risk letting him speak in front of the world, so they let him go, quietly, reluctantly, but not without surveillance. For the rest of his life, the government kept watching, but Robert F. Williams kept building. He settled in Michigan, wrote books, and mentored a new generation of activists. And although the cameras never followed him the way they did King or Malcolm, his fingerprints were everywhere. Every chant of Black Power, every armed patrol of Panther neighborhoods, every act of self-defense rooted in dignity rather than submission, that was Williams. The man they tried to erase had already written himself into history. What if I told you the most radical idea of the civil rights era wasn't a speech, wasn't a march, wasn't even a law? It was a rifle in the hands of a black man, held not to terrorize but to protect. And that image, that courage, that blueprint, it didn't come from the Black Panthers. It came from Robert F. Williams. By the time he returned from exile in the early 70s, Robert F. Williams was no longer a national headline. The media had moved on. America had turned the page. But in the neighborhoods, on the streets, and in the minds of a restless generation, Williams was still revolutionary scripture. The Panthers called him Brother Rob. To them, he wasn't a ghost of the past, he was the foundation. When Huey Newton talked about policing the police, when young brothers patrolled their blocks with law books in one hand and rifles in the other, they were walking straight out of Robert's pages. Let's be real. Before the Panthers strapped up, before, by any means necessary, echoed through the nation, it was Williams who dared to say it first. But instead of building a flashy media campaign, Robert built something stronger, a philosophy. Self-defense wasn't just about bullets. It was about boundaries, about dignity, about saying, I am not your victim, I am not disposable, I will not beg for what I am born with. And that message, it traveled. You see, while Robert was branded a fugitive in the States, overseas he was seen as a freedom architect. In Cuba, in China, in Africa, his ideas became part of the global liberation language. Black South Africans facing apartheid, revolutionaries in Angola and Mozambique. They all tuned in to Radio Free Dixie. They read Negroes with Guns, and they saw in Robert what America tried to bury, a man who never apologized for surviving. But let's not romanticize it. The government didn't just forgive and forget. They surveilled him, isolated him, blackballed his name from history books. When young organizers asked about him, they were warned, that man is too radical. When schools taught civil rights history, his name was mysteriously missing. And when Hollywood came knocking, they skipped over the man who inspired an entire generation because his truth was too uncomfortable, too black, too armed, too unapologetic. But he never stopped teaching. Back in Michigan, Robert kept speaking to students, writing essays, advising organizers, passing on the code. He said, "Freedom is not won by passive acceptance. It is taken and it is protected." That idea lit a fire in activists who came after Assata Shakur, Fred Hampton, Angela Davis. Even groups like Deacons for Defense drew direct inspiration from his tactics. He may not have been on TV, but he was in the DNA of black resistance. Let's talk legacy. When you think civil rights, you probably picture King's Dream or Malcolm's Fire. But what about the space between? The space where dignity meets discipline, where restraint meets resistance, where a father stands at his door, rifle in hand, not to threaten, but to say, "Not my children, not today." That space? Robert built it, and it's still with us. Today, when black communities organize cop watch patrols, when citizens film police brutality, when people chant, "We have the right to defend ourselves," they're echoing Williams, whether they know it or not. His name may be faded in textbooks, but his spirit is coded into our survival. And here's the kicker. He didn't hate America. He believed in the promise of it, but he refused to let that promise come at the cost of black blood. That's not rage. That's righteous clarity. In the final years of his life, Robert watched as the world caught up to what he'd been saying for decades. He saw black politicians rise to power. He saw student protests embrace global solidarity. He saw young folks say no, loudly, boldly, and without fear. And even as illness set in, he never stopped pushing, never stopped planting seeds, never stopped challenging black folks to value their lives enough to protect them. He passed away in 1996. No massive media tribute, no national holiday, just quiet. But make no mistake, his impact roars louder now than ever. Because every time a community refuses to be bulldozed, every time a mother teaches her son that he's worthy of protection, every time a camera phone becomes a shield, Robert is there, watching, smiling, saying, "I told you we were worth it." What happens when a man who helped shape black resistance gets erased from the very history he helped create? What happens when a nation silences the voice that taught black America how to defend itself? By the time Robert F. Williams died in 1996, the history books had already moved on. His name, left out of school curriculums, his book Negroes with Guns, out of print and buried, his impact, whispered in activist circles but never shouted from podiums. Let that sink in. The man who inspired Malcolm, who laid the groundwork for the Panthers, who redefined what it meant to be black and unafraid, was almost wiped from America's memory. Almost. So how did it happen? How did a man who once had the FBI chasing him across borders, who broadcasted from Cuba, China, and Algeria, who was hailed as a hero by liberation movements across the globe, get reduced to a footnote? Simple. Because Robert F. Williams committed the one crime America couldn't forgive. He refused to be a victim. Let's be clear. America can sometimes tolerate a protest, even a march, sometimes even a riot. But a black man, disciplined, educated, and armed with principle, that's the threat they couldn't box in. Robert didn't fit the narrative. He wasn't begging, he wasn't broken, he wasn't asking for a seat at the table. He built his own table, and he dared to say, "I'll protect mine," by any means necessary. And for that, they erased him. Media outlets painted him as dangerous, a radical, an extremist. But let's unpack that. Was he dangerous because he told black folks to defend their children? Was he extreme for organizing patrols to stop white supremacist kidnappings? Was he radical for telling men in Monroe, North Carolina, you have a right, no, a duty to live, to protect your wives, your homes, your futures? That wasn't radical. That was righteous self-respect. But the government labeled it subversion. And just like that, he vanished from the spotlight. While others were turned into icons, their faces on t-shirts, their quotes turned into slogans, Robert was locked out. He didn't get a monument. No boulevard in his name, no national holiday, and yet you can feel his fingerprints everywhere. When young activists in Ferguson chanted, "We ready for war," when black moms in Mississippi taught their daughters how to record a traffic stop, when neighborhoods began organizing legal self-defense training, that wasn't new. That was Robert echoing through time, through every street camera, every raised fist, every community that says, "We won't die quietly." You see, America couldn't erase what he stood for, because what Robert gave us wasn't just a book or a speech. He gave us permission. Permission to protect our families, permission to be angry, permission to survive without apology. And that is why his story had to be hidden. Because once you realize Robert was right, you start questioning everything else. So what's the legacy? What does Robert F. Williams mean today? In an era of mass surveillance, police brutality, and state-sanctioned violence, his blueprint is more urgent than ever. He reminds us that freedom isn't just about what laws say, it's about what we're willing to defend. That dignity isn't just spoken, it's enforced. And that self-love sometimes looks like self-defense. He also forces us to ask, why are certain revolutionaries remembered while others are buried? Why are we taught to worship the peaceful and fear the prepared? And why are black people still made to feel unsafe when they demand protection? Robert F. Williams doesn't just challenge the system, he challenges the storyline, and that might be the most dangerous thing of all. But here's the truth they can't erase. His ideas are still here. His words are still powerful. His blueprint still works. And as long as we tell his story, loudly, fearlessly, unapologetically, he can never be erased again. So the next time someone tells you that black people should just wait, just pray, just vote, just comply, you remember Robert F. Williams. Remember the man who told America, "I will not be a passive partner in my own oppression," and then picked up a mic and a rifle and told his people, "You are worth protecting." This isn't the end of his story, because you are the next chapter. Every time you speak truth, every time you defend your community, every time you refuse to shrink, you carry Robert's name with you, not as a ghost, but as a guide. Because we don't need permission to exist, we need power to persist.